Hello and welcome to Context, where we take a careful look at top stories of the day, subjecting them to careful examination. Now we turn our attention to Ukraine, where despite a partial ceasefire agreement, arguably attained between the conflicting sides through the US mediation, battlefield circumstances leave a lot to be desired. At a recent joint press briefing with his Czech counterpart held in Kyiv, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reiterated the necessity of applying more pressure on Russia to achieve a sustainable ceasefire. It has also recently been reported that the US is willing to involve European partners in peace talks on the war in Ukraine, as Russia grows increasingly vocal about the necessity of the removal of some of the EU-imposed sanctions on Moscow. The latter element is of great significance for between 2022 and 2024, the essence of collective Western support for Ukraine was largely contingent upon both assisting Ukraine and weakening Russia and its economy by means of the implementation of series of punitive measures of economic nature. There are quite a number of questions to be asked in this regard, of course. What is there next for Ukraine? Will these two tracks of negotiations involving Russia-Ukraine talks in the way of two separate tracks eventually evolve into one singular trilateral format involving Ukraine, Russia and the US, with the latter acting as a proper mediator? And how do Russia and Ukraine understand the concept of compromise? And what diplomatic efforts should be made in order to steer the more than 3-year-long war towards a lasting peace? To explore these and many other questions of great import, joining me now live is John Kavalik, Senior Editor with Issue Insight. Welcome, Mr. Kavalik. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
First of all, I would like to ask you about the format of the negotiations. I earlier in my introduction referred to two separate tracks involving US-Russia talks and also US-Ukraine talks. Is it, all of those negotiations cumulatively designed in a way that these two tracks eventually need to transmogrify into one solid trilateral format with US acting as a proper mediator?
Italy, a trilateral now, in some respects, it's a game of political dodgeball, where in Saudi Arabia this week, we're going to have US meeting with the Ukrainians and then the Saudis at the table. Their role is almost like a note keeper, timekeeper, sort of, hey, whatever you say, remember there's someone else in the room that's hearing it too. So if you're going to lie or exaggerate, remember that witness. And then there'll be the US and the Ukrainians, and again with the Saudis. So you have these, separate three, and the goal is eventually to have the Russians and the Ukrainians. And the process to get there is sort of an elimination process. And it's all about building confidence, building and acceptability among each other. And how they'll do that is they will work through, each will prepare a list, the Ukrainians and the Russians, what's most important, what's least important. And the US will then try to take, in essence, reverse order. What is the easiest to agree on? And then work our way upwards. So each step builds confidence on the previous step. And then eventually the goal will be the Russians and the Ukrainians working together. And then the US will be on one end of the table, the Saudis other end, but they'll, again, both of them will be there as this timekeeper, scorekeeper, keeping everybody honest.
Yeah, in fact, now we have two trilateral tracks with Saudis acting as mediator between, not mediator, but providing venue for Russians and Ukrainians talk to each other. And so Russians and Americans talk to each other, and the Russians and Americans talk to each other. So what has actually been agreed by now between Ukraine and Russia via the US mediation? We talked about partial ceasefire deal. What is its universally understood scope. We understand that because readouts coming from Washington and Moscow, they're not in line fully. But what is that fully, not fully, but discernibly agreed between Russia and Ukraine by the US as part of this limited ceasefire?
I think the only agenda item that everyone will agree that there has been an agreement on, and that is to keep talking. Other than that, the limited ceasefire where President Trump initially wanted a complete ceasefire, just stop killing one another for 30 days or more, and then begin talking during that time. Ukraine initially didn't want it. Russia indicated that they were looking at it, not unfavorably. Then the Ukrainians said, well, wait a minute, why don't we do nothing sea-related and nothing infrastructure-related? Let's those. And the Russians, well, maybe we'll look at that on the infrastructure side. But then there was a disagreement on whether it was energy and infrastructure or energy infrastructure. So right now, what we really have, Russia and Ukraine both saying that they're interested to stop the war, saying that they want to do it as far as a process in a different way, but both agreeing that they'll continue to speak either indirectly through the US, hosted by Saudi Arabia, or in some respects, when they do the prisoner exchange and some of the other, it basically a direct communication, for all intents and purposes. So where we are, this week is they've agreed to continue to talk, and they're continuing to fight, and that's where we all are.
See, and it has been said that Donald Trump had some expectations that realistically something very quickly could have been attained, and now he's actually in many ways struggling to secure fast ceasefire in Ukraine. What are the, do you think, challenges that the president is facing now? Was he serious about the fact that this thing would happen very quickly? We understand that the battlefield circumstances in Ukraine are very complicated. Ceasefire will take some time to secure. But were there initially unrealistic expectations on the part of President Trump about the quick, easy solution, fix?
His expectations, go back to during the campaign. I can solve this in 24 hours. I can get it done before I'm even inaugurated. I can get this done quickly. And slowly, that timetable has metastasized into molasses as opposed to, running water. It's still doable. And to be fair to the president, in the conversations he's had, whether they be with President Putin, President Zelensky, he is, tend to hear what he wants to hear or create the mood that he wants to create out of the conversations to spin more positively. And in terms of President Putin, President Zelensky, they're spinning theirs, versions as well. As you pointed out, the readouts of these calls, it's spectacular when you read 3 or 4 government readouts of calls, and you're wondering, well, did these calls really happen between these people? Because they're just so different. The president, he's making a good effort. There's no question he's devoting resources of the administration to try to get something done. I think he will get something done. It's just there has been, as most of these discussions and negotiations are, there are unknowns that take place, and you just sort of try to move with them. But I think in the end, will he get his ceasefire? Yes, he will. Will that lead to a peace agreement between the Russian Federation and Ukraine? I'm not so certain. Will there be a frozen conflict before we get anything else? Most certainly.
And ceasefire, many would say partial ceasefire, a relatively partial ceasefire, semi-partial ceasefire, this sort of things could be attained. But former National Security Advisor John Bolton said that President Trump does not understand the whole complexity of the situation. There are those who believe that Donald Trump's belief in the power of his personal one-on-one diplomacy may have been displaced, but ultimately I think there's a very clear acknowledgement across the European countries that President Trump has changed the global debate about Ukraine, and that's something which is accepted by practically everybody. And I want to move to another very interesting subject involving sanctions. It has been recently reported that US is willing to involve European partners in peace talks on the war in Ukraine, as I mentioned in the introduction, and that Russia is increasingly demanding that some of the EU-imposed sanctions should be lifted as well. When we talk about European involvement in peace talks, is this involvement circumscribed to the sanctions part only, or does it envisage some form of proactive European role on the substance of Ukraine's future and negotiations surrounding that?
There's no question that the European Union, in terms of its lead in Brussels, is incredibly frustrated because they're not in Saudi Arabia. And President Trump has deliberately kept the EU as an entity out of the talks. I mean, he looks at Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, he looks at her as an administrator. She perceives herself as head of state, head of government, sort of both, even above that. So for him, he's not interested. He'll deal with President Macron, he'll deal with Prime Minister Son, he'll deal with Chancellor Merz, he'll deal with Prime Minister Starmer, Prime Minister Maloney, but the EU as an entity has to come into play because, as President Putin well knows, the US does have unilateral sanctions on Russia, but it's the EU sanctions that are truly penetrating and truly bite, because far more of Russia's economic interests lie with the European Union than they do with the United States in terms of importing and exporting, in terms of whether it's tourist travel, whether it's integration with banking. So President Putin is absolutely going to say, hey, now I want to throw this into the mix. And President does seem to be maintaining his line that the ceasefire is separate from negotiations on ending the war. And he's thus far, he keeps sticking to, including yesterday's statements with the Defense Secretary Hegseth in the Oval Office when he was doing the pool spray. And he again was saying, I want these people to stop dying on both. And so in his mind, you don't get to anything else unless the bullets stop. And once he's able to do that, then I think you see him being far more engaging with President Putin and with President Zelensky in terms of, okay, let's talk about the sanctions, because that's a part of the negotiation. So he's keeping everything separate. It's going to be interesting to see if he can continue to do it. John Bolton is a very, very smart guy and a survivor of many decades of Republican and Democratic politics. But there's one thing he's not, and I'm not, the President of the United States. And Donald Trump is.
Well, actually, very interestingly, I think Michael Gove, for a British politician, reflected on President Donald Trump's characteristics. And he said that he's not an intellectual in a conventional sense of this word, but he has got the sense for what is to be done. He's got this sense what is the right thing to do in his own understanding, of course. And he does recognize power. He does recognize that there are three emperors. One is China, the leader of China, one is Russia, and one is the United States of America. Didn't say anything about Europe as a whole. We understand it doesn't take into yes, indeed. And it looks like that in Trump's worldview, there are three fundamental, powerful centers, and United States is one of them. So that is something very central to what he thinks should be done. And my last question to you is going to be about Turkey. You are in Turkey at the moment. Turkey does seem to be completely sidelined from these negotiations, but how do you see the role of Ankara for the next few months? Do you think, in the light of this transatlantic alliance appearing to have been properly shaken, in the light of European frustration with the United States? Is there a new avenue, new opening for Turkey to be more proactive in building European defense architecture? In the context of Ukraine as well.
I was right. Yeah, I was surprised that Saudi Arabia has won the hosting sweepstakes. It did that because it is able to wave a lot of money toward President Trump in terms of investment in that, and so they win. Turkey did host the first round of Russia-U.S. direct diplomatic talks, and that was very important. This round of discussions in Saudi Arabia, there have been some discussion, or there have been reporting that going to include the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which of course was President Erdogan's political baby, and it worked for a while until the Russians decided they didn't want to participate, and then it became obsolete because the Ukrainians just said, okay, well, we won't do a straight line across the Black Sea where we're nearer, where the ships are nearer to Russian engagement. We'll just hug the coasts of the Black Sea countries. Those will be in their waters, and we'll just keep it working. It'll be a little longer, and that's what they've done. So Turkey, a little bit sidelined. Maybe they'll come back in because of the discussion on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which, of course, nothing can get in or out of the Black Sea unless through the Bosphorus Straits, and that means through Turkey. In terms of Turkey's engagement, re-engagement, the European Union vis-a-vis President Trump and military, that the European Union has said we need to expand our defensive architecture. We need to get product. Well, one country that has product and that exports a lot of product and a lot of quality product, including into Ukraine, is Turkey. The problem is Turkey is not a member of the European Union. And there are European Union members who are saying, well, wait, we need to spend all this money, but we don't want to be buying American stuff because we don't like President Trump. We're concerned about buying Turkey. Yes, Turkey is a NATO member, but it's not exactly politically aligned with the European values, as some leaders would say in Brussels. So that leaves Turkey in this constant balancing, floating way where I think Turkey can play a huge role. But now you've got the last week of optical turmoil here.
Yes.
And that just buries almost everything else because it makes difficult heads of state and heads of government in the European Union to talk about integrating Turkey, whether it's in the defense architecture for equipment or move along the EU. And then with the United States, there's no question President Trump, President Erdogan do get along. The reporting Erdogan's looking maybe to visit in April the U.S. But what's happened the last week does constrain President Trump a little, not necessarily about what he thinks, but the people in his administration and more important members of Congress who are very, very vocal about their opinions relating to what the government of Turkey does and doesn't do. So unfortunately, this hasn't been a great week here in terms of moving along with what everyone would like them to move along toward.
This hasn't been an incredibly positive week for Turkey, I think that, to put it mildly, because as I'm sure, as you mentioned in your latest interview with my colleague Anastasia Lavrina, some of that what you refer to as optical turmoil could distract from some of the geopolitical ambitions pursued by Ankara. And in that sense, of course, it's not helpful at all. Mr. John Kavallik, so grateful to you for your time and for your very, very detailed answers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much indeed. This was John Kavallik, Senior Editor at Issue Insight, with whom we have discussed latest developments in the realm of Ukraine peace talks involving two bilateral, actually trilateral tracks, because Saudi Arabia is involved in that process as well. And we discussed the possibility of those two trilateral formats involving Saudi Arabia acting as a mediator between United States and Russia, and United States and Ukraine, eventually transforming into a solid trilateral format and potentially into some form of bilateral format between Russia and Ukraine, because there have been some direct contacts between Kyiv and Moscow in relation to some of the issues revolving around exchange of prisoners and so forth. Indeed, it is difficult to say with any degree of certainty if the current phase of negotiations will lead to tangible results anytime soon. But I suppose one particular moment is more or less clear. What was unthinkable yesterday is more than acceptable and thinkable today. Even Ukraine's most steadfast allies accept the fact that some territorial concessions are not entirely in the realm of impossibility. Stay informed, stay engaged. I'm Orkhan Amashov. You are watching Context, and see you very soon indeed.